close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the past come alive. Tonight, we journey back to one of the most dramatic chapters in history, the American Civil War. A story of courage and conflict, brother against brother, of dreams divided and a nation reborn. From the booming cannons at Fort Sumter to the final surrender at Appomattox, you'll drift through every moment as if time itself is guiding you. So lay back, relax, and fall asleep to the entire history of the American Civil War. Before the Civil War began, America was already a land full of tension, dreams, and deep divisions. In the early 1800s, the United States was still young, only about 80 years old, but the nation was growing fast. People were moving west, building new towns, starting farms, and dreaming of a brighter future. But under this hopeful picture, there was a dark shadow-on argument that refused to go away: slavery. In the South, slavery was the foundation of the economy. Huge plantations of cotton, tobacco, and sugar depended on enslaved African Americans who were forced to work under brutal conditions. The wealth of many southern states was built on their suffering. In contrast, the North was different. Factories, industries, and small farms shaped life there. Many Northerners were beginning to believe slavery was not only unfair but also immoral. This difference in belief created a growing wall between the two regions. The question became bigger as the country expanded westward. Every time a new state was added, Americans argued, would it allow slavery or not? Politicians tried to compromise again and again. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and later the Compromise of 1850 were attempts to keep balance between free states and slave states. But each agreement was only a temporary fix, like putting a small bandage on a very deep wound. As years passed, new voices rose across the nation. Abolitionists in the North, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe, spoke out strongly against slavery. Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, opened the eyes of many Americans to the cruelty of the system. Meanwhile, Southern leaders defended slavery fiercely, saying their entire way of life depended on it. They believed that without slavery, their farms and economy would collapse. This divide grew even sharper when the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. The result was bloody conflict, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups fought violently in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. The nation watched in horror as neighbors killed each other over this issue, and many began to wonder if the United States could survive such hatred. Then came the rise of a new political leader, Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, Lincoln was elected president. He was from the North, and while he promised not to end slavery immediately, he opposed its spread into new territories. To the South, his election felt like a direct threat. Southern leaders feared Lincoln would eventually destroy slavery altogether, and with it, their way of life. For many in the South, Lincoln's victory was the final straw. Within weeks, Southern states began declaring they would leave the Union. They believed they had the right to govern themselves and protect slavery without interference from Washington. These states formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. By early 1861, the United States was no longer united. On one side stood the Union, determined to preserve the nation. On the other stood the Confederacy, ready to fight for independence and the continuation of slavery. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Everyone knew that war was coming, it was only a matter of when, not if. This was America before the storm, a country divided by beliefs, split by economy, and torn apart by the question of human freedom. The stage was set, and soon the first shots of the Civil War would be fired. The Civil War truly began on a quiet spring morning in April 1861. When the first cannon was fired at Fort Sumter, a Union fort sitting in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort itself was not very large, just a stone structure built on an artificial island, but it carried enormous importance. It was a symbol of the United States government's authority in the South. And for the newly formed Confederacy, leaving such a fort in Union hands was unacceptable. In the months leading up to the attack, tensions had been building like a drumbeat. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, and soon 6 more followed. Together, they declared themselves independent and formed their own government with Jefferson Davis as their president. But the question was simple. Would the Union allow them to leave peacefully, or would it fight to preserve the nation? When Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, he faced his first major test. Fort Sumter was running out of supplies, and its commander, Major Robert Anderson, sent word that his men would soon be hungry and helpless. Lincoln had to decide: abandon the fort and recognize the Confederacy's claim, or send supplies and risk war. Lincoln chose carefully. He announced he would send only food, not weapons, to the soldiers inside. But to the Confederates, even food felt like a challenge to their new authority. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate cannons opened fire. Shells lit up the dark sky, booming across Charleston Harbor. For 34 hours, the Confederates bombarded Fort Sumter without pause. The Union soldiers inside bravely returned fire, but they were heavily outnumbered, and their supplies were nearly gone. Smoke filled the air, bricks crumbled from the walls, and the roar of cannon fire echoed across the city. Finally, Major Anderson realized his men could no longer fight. On April 13th, he surrendered the fort. Miraculously, no one died during the battle itself, though one Union soldier was killed later during the surrender ceremony. But the impact of this event was enormous. The news spread like wildfire across the nation. The war had officially begun. In the North, people were shocked and outraged. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Across towns and cities, men rushed to sign up, believing the war would be short and glorious. Bands played, flags waved, and families cheered their loved ones as they marched off to training camps. Few could imagine the years of blood and hardship that lay ahead. In the South, the fall of Fort Sumter was celebrated as a great victory. Crowds cheered in the streets, church bells rang, and many Confederates believed they had proven their strength. More Southern states joined the Confederacy, convinced that secession was the right choice. The Confederates thought the North would quickly give up and independence would be secure. But instead, Fort Sumter united the Union like never before. Northerners who had been divided now stood together. Lincoln made it clear: the Union must be preserved. He declared that the rebellion was not just a political argument, but a direct attack on democracy itself. For him, if the Union could be broken so easily, then no nation built on freedom could ever survive. And so, with the smoke still clearing over Charleston Harbor, both sides prepared for a long and bitter struggle. What had begun as cannon fire over a small fort would grow into the bloodiest conflict in American history. After the cannons fell silent at Fort Sumter, both the Union and the Confederacy believed the war would be quick. Most people thought it would last only a few months. Young men full of excitement and pride rushed to enlist. They saw war as an adventure, a chance to prove themselves, and a way to defend their homeland. But they did not yet understand the terrible reality that awaited them. In the summer of 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War took place in Virginia, near a small stream called Bull Run, or Manassas, as the Confederates called it. Thousands of soldiers from both sides marched into the fields, cheered on by civilians who came with picnic baskets, expecting to watch a quick Union victory. Families thought they were about to see history made in a single afternoon. At first, it seemed the Union Army was winning. They pushed back the Confederate lines and confidence grew. But the South had strong leaders, including General Thomas Jackson. His troops stood firm against the attack. Jackson earned his famous nickname, Stonewall Jackson, because he held his ground like a stone wall. With reinforcements arriving, the Confederates counterattacked, sending Union soldiers running in confusion. The picnic crowds scattered, and what began as a day of excitement turned into chaos and fear. The First Battle of Bull Run shocked the nation. The Union realized this would not be an easy war. Soldiers were inexperienced, supplies were short, and leadership was untested. Many men who thought they would be home by Christmas instead began to see that this fight could last much longer. The Confederacy, on the other hand, celebrated their victory. They believed this proved their courage and strength. Many Southerners felt certain they could win independence if they kept fighting hard. In the months that followed, more battles erupted. Skirmishes broke out in Missouri and Kentucky, states caught between North and South. In the Western Territories, Union General Ulysses S. Grant began to rise as a strong commander, winning important victories along the rivers of Tennessee. But in the East, near Washington, D.C., the Union struggled. Confederate armies, led by skilled generals like Robert E. Lee, defended their land with determination. Life for soldiers on both sides quickly became harsh. They marched for miles in worn-out shoes, slept on the cold ground, and ate whatever food they could find. Disease spread through camps, sometimes killing more men than actual battles. Letters home told stories of loneliness, fear, and the longing for family. For many, the dream of adventure was replaced by the painful truth of war. Still, both the Union and the Confederacy held on to hope. Each side believed that the next battle might bring a turning point, that one great victory could end the war. Newspapers published bold headlines, stirring speeches were made, and families prayed for their loved ones. The war was only beginning, and the expectations of glory were still alive. Even as the cost of conflict started to grow heavier with every passing month. The early battles of the Civil War revealed a simple truth. This was no short quarrel. It was the start of a long, bloody struggle that would test the courage, endurance, and spirit of an entire nation. After the shock of Bull Run, the Union realized that defeating the Confederacy would not be easy. President Abraham Lincoln and his generals had to think carefully. The South was fighting on its own land, with passionate soldiers and skilled leaders. The North, however, had more people, more factories, more railroads, and more money. The question was, how could the Union use these advantages to win the war? A key idea came from General Winfield Scott, an old but wise military leader. He believed the war would not be won by rushing into battles alone. Instead, the Union needed a big plan, a way to slowly squeeze the South until it could no longer resist. This idea became known as the Anaconda Plan. Named after the giant snake that wraps itself around its prey and crushes it, the plan had three main parts. Blockade the southern ports. The Union Navy would spread out along the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico to stop the Confederacy from selling cotton to Europe or buying weapons and supplies. If the South could not trade, its economy would collapse. Control the Mississippi River. By capturing the river, the Union could cut the Confederacy in half. States west of the Mississippi, like Texas and Arkansas, would be separated from the rest of the South, making it harder for them to send men and supplies. Capture Richmond, Virginia. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. If the Union could seize it, the Southern government would be shaken, and the war might quickly end. At first, many Northerners laughed at Scott's plan. They thought it sounded too slow. People wanted fast victories, not a long squeeze. But Lincoln saw the wisdom in it. He ordered the Navy to begin building a blockade, and Union generals were sent to fight for control of the Mississippi. Step by step, the plan began to take shape. The blockade was not perfect at first. The Union Navy was small and had to guard thousands of miles of coastline. Clever Southern sailors, called blockade runners, used fast ships to slip past Union warships and bring in supplies. Still, as the war went on, the blockade grew stronger. The South found it harder and harder to get what it needed, and prices for food and goods began to rise sharply. On the Mississippi, Union forces started making progress. In early 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, proving himself as a bold and determined leader. Soon, the Union also won a bloody but important battle at Shiloh, showing that control of the western rivers was within reach. Every step brought the Union closer to cutting the Confederacy in two. Meanwhile, Union leaders kept their eyes on Richmond. Several attempts were made to march into Virginia, but Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson proved to be fierce defenders. For now, Richmond remained safe, but the Union never stopped thinking about it as the ultimate prize. The Anaconda Plan showed that the Union was fighting not just with bravery, but with patience and strategy. It would take time, but if the North could keep tightening its grip blockade by blockade, river by river, city by city, the Confederacy might eventually be crushed, just like the snake's prey. The plan gave the Union a clear path forward. Yet as the war continued, both sides would learn that victory would not come easily. It would demand sacrifice, courage, and years of struggle before the final outcome was decided. When people think about war, they often picture dramatic battles, flags waving, and cannons roaring. But for the average soldier in the Civil War, most days were not spent fighting. Instead, life was filled with waiting, marching, and struggling to survive the harsh conditions of camp life. For many young men, the reality of war was far different from the excitement they imagined when they first enlisted. Most soldiers were very young, often between 18 and 25 years old, though some were even younger. Boys as young as 12 or 13 served as drummers or messengers, while older men in their 40s also marched into battle. They came from farms, towns, and cities across America. For many, it was their first time leaving home, and they suddenly found themselves living among hundreds of strangers in military camps. Camp life was crowded and uncomfortable. Soldiers slept in tents or makeshift shelters, often on the bare ground with little protection from the cold or rain. Blankets were thin, and when the weather turned harsh, frostbite and sickness spread quickly. Food was simple and often unpleasant. A soldier's daily meal might include hardtack, a dry, tough biscuit along with salted pork or beans. Fresh food was rare, and soldiers sometimes went hungry when supplies ran low. Diseases were one of the greatest threats. Poor sanitation in camps led to outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, and pneumonia. In fact, more soldiers died from disease than from battle wounds. Doctors did not yet understand germs, and medical care was often rough and painful. Amputations were common, and without proper anesthesia or clean instruments, many soldiers feared the hospital more than the battlefield. Despite these hardships, soldiers formed strong bonds with one another. They shared stories, sang songs, and wrote letters home whenever they could. Letters were a lifeline, bringing comfort from family and reminding soldiers what they were fighting for. In return, families treasured these letters, often reading them aloud to neighbors and keeping them as precious memories. Daily life also involved endless drills and marching. Officers believed discipline and training were the key to victory. Soldiers practiced forming lines, aiming rifles, and following commands for hours each day. The marching was exhausting, sometimes covering 20 miles in a single day. With heavy packs, muskets, and little rest, many soldiers collapsed from fatigue. Yet, they pushed on, driven by duty and the encouragement of their comrades. Entertainment was rare, but important. Soldiers played cards, carved wood, and even staged plays or sang together to pass the time. Music was a powerful part of camp life. Songs like Dixie in the South or the Battle Hymn of the Republic in the North lifted spirits and reminded men of the cause they fought for. For Union soldiers, the war was often seen as a fight to preserve the nation, while Confederate soldiers believed they were defending their homeland and way of life. These beliefs gave them strength, but they also fueled the determination to keep fighting, no matter how hard life became. The life of a Civil War soldier was not easy. It was filled with hunger, sickness, boredom, and danger. Yet in the midst of hardship, soldiers discovered courage, friendship, and resilience. Their experiences remind us that war is not just about battles, it is about the ordinary. Men who endure extraordinary struggles in the hope of a better future. While soldiers fought on the battlefield, life at home was transformed in powerful and unexpected ways. Women and families carried heavy burdens during the Civil War. With husbands, fathers, and sons gone to fight, everyday responsibilities fell on those left behind. Farms still needed planting, businesses had to be managed, and children had to be cared for. Across both the North and South, women stepped forward with strength and courage, proving that war was not just fought with guns, but also with resilience at home. For many women, the first challenge was survival. In the South especially, the war brought shortages of food, clothing, and basic supplies. Blockades cut off trade, and with men away, it became harder to keep farms and households running. Mothers worked long hours in the fields, sewed clothes from scraps, and learned to stretch every bit of food. Some even faced starvation when crops failed or Union armies marched through, destroying homes and barns. Families often relied on community support, with neighbors helping each other just to get by. In the North, life was different, but still demanding. Factories boomed, producing weapons, uniforms, and supplies for the army. Women filled jobs once held by men, working long hours in harsh conditions. They earned little pay, but their labor kept the Union war effort alive. Women also organized aid societies, gathering food, bandages, and blankets to send to soldiers at the front. For many, this was their way of serving the cause. Nursing became one of the most important roles for women during the war. At first, many believed women should not be near battlefields, But as casualties grew, their help became essential. Thousands of women volunteered as nurses, caring for the wounded and comforting the dying. Figures like Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, became famous for their bravery and compassion. She worked tirelessly on the front lines, earning the nickname the Angel of the Battlefield. Women also became spies, messengers, and even disguised themselves as soldiers. Some, like Harriet Tubman, used their courage to fight for freedom. Already famous for leading enslaved people to safety through the Underground Railroad, Tubman served as a Union scout and spy. She guided raids, gathered intelligence, and proved that women could play a direct role in military operations. Back home, children also felt the weight of war. They missed their fathers and older brothers, often taking on extra work to help their families survive. Many children wrote letters filled with love and hope, reminding soldiers that they were not forgotten. These small voices of encouragement gave strength to men on the battlefield. The emotional toll on families was immense. Letters from the front were treasured, read and reread until the paper wore thin. Every knock at the door brought both hope and fear. Was it news of a loved one returning, or a message of death? Graves multiplied across the nation, and countless families mourned the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons. Yet, through hardship, women and families found resilience. They proved that war was not just about armies clashing, but about entire communities enduring together. Their courage shaped the course of the conflict and left a lasting mark on American society. After the war, many women continued to demand greater roles and rights, pointing to their wartime sacrifices as proof of their strength and capability. The Civil War was fought on the battlefield, but it was also fought in kitchens, fields, factories, and hospitals. Women and families carried the weight of survival, sacrifice, and service. Their stories remind us that the heart of war is not only in the noise of cannons, but also in the quiet strength of those who keep life going when everything seems to fall apart. At the very heart of the Civil War lay one of the most powerful and painful issues in American history: slavery. For decades before the war, politicians argued over it, states divided because of it, and people gave their lives fighting against it. When the war began, President Abraham Lincoln was careful with his words. His main goal, at least in the beginning, was to save the Union. But as the conflict grew, it became clear that slavery and freedom were issues the nation could not avoid. In the South, slavery was considered the backbone of the economy. Plantations of cotton, rice, and tobacco depended on enslaved African Americans, who were forced to work under brutal conditions with no rights of their own. Enslaved families were torn apart, sold at auctions, and treated as property. For generations, people endured unimaginable suffering while dreaming of freedom. When the Confederacy formed, it openly declared slavery as a cornerstone of its society. In the North, attitudes toward slavery were more divided. Many Northerners opposed it, believing it was morally wrong and against the principles of freedom. Abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, raised their voices loudly, demanding that slavery be ended forever. Yet not all Northerners were abolitionists. Some cared more about keeping the Union together than about freeing enslaved people. Lincoln himself faced this challenge. He personally disliked slavery, but as president, he feared that if he moved too quickly, the border states, slave states that had stayed loyal to the Union, might join the Confederacy. Still, enslaved people did not wait for politicians to decide their fate. Wherever Union armies marched into the South, enslaved men, women, and children fled plantations and sought safety behind Union lines. They were called contrabands of war, since they were considered captured property of the Confederacy. But to the people themselves, this was the first step toward freedom. Thousands joined the Union cause, building fortifications, cooking meals, and even becoming soldiers when given the chance. Their presence forced the Union government to face the truth. The war was about slavery as much as it was about preserving the nation. As the war dragged on and casualties grew, Lincoln began to see that freedom could also be a weapon. If enslaved people were freed, the Confederacy would lose its labor force, and the Union would gain moral strength. The idea of emancipation, freeing enslaved people, moved closer to reality. Lincoln carefully waited for the right moment. He knew such a decision would change everything, turning the war into a fight not just for the Union, but for human freedom itself. Meanwhile, debates raged across the North. Some people worried emancipation would anger soldiers or split public opinion. Others believed it was the only way to give the war a real purpose. Newspapers argued, politicians fought in Congress, and ordinary citizens discussed what kind of nation America should be after the war. By 1862, the emancipation question could no longer be ignored. The bloodshed had reached shocking levels, and the future of millions hung in the balance. Lincoln prepared to take a bold step that would forever change the course of the war and the destiny of the United States. By the middle of 1862, the Civil War had already become one of the bloodiest conflicts America had ever seen. Thousands of soldiers had fallen, battles stretched on with no clear end, and the nation seemed trapped in endless sorrow. President Abraham Lincoln knew the Union needed something more, something that would give the war a higher purpose. That something became the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would transform the meaning of the war forever. Lincoln had long hated slavery, but he had also been cautious. At the start of the war, his main goal was to keep the Union together. He feared that if he moved too quickly against slavery, border states like Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware might join the Confederacy. But as the war continued, the pressure grew. Thousands of enslaved people were already escaping to Union lines, proving with their own actions that the war was about freedom. Abolitionists across the North demanded that Lincoln strike directly at slavery, not just the rebellion. The turning point came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. This battle in Maryland was one of the bloodiest single days in American history, with more than 20,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Though the battle was technically a draw, the Confederates retreated first, giving Lincoln the chance he had been waiting for. I had already drafted a proclamation, but he needed a Union victory to announce it. Now, with Antietam behind him, the moment had come. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation. He declared that unless the Confederate States returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in those states would be set free. Of course, the Confederacy ignored the warning, so on January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation officially went into effect. The proclamation was not perfect. It did not free enslaved people in the loyal border states, nor in parts of the South already under Union control. Instead, it applied only to areas still in rebellion against the United States. In a sense, it freed people where Lincoln had no immediate power, yet the impact was enormous. With one stroke of the pen, the war became not just about saving the Union, but also about ending slavery. For enslaved people across the South, the proclamation was a beacon of hope. Many heard the news and fled plantations to find Union lines where they could finally claim freedom. Others stayed and resisted quietly, knowing that change was on the horizon. For the first time, the federal government had declared that slavery was incompatible with the future of the United States. The proclamation also changed the Union Army itself. It opened the door for African Americans to serve as soldiers. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black men had joined the Union forces, fighting bravely for the freedom of their people and the survival of the nation. Abroad, the proclamation had another powerful effect. Many in Europe, especially in Britain and France, had considered supporting the Confederacy because of their need for Southern cotton. But once Lincoln made the war about slavery, European governments hesitated. Supporting the Confederacy now meant supporting slavery, something most European citizens would not accept. This helped prevent foreign nations from officially recognizing the South. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery. Everywhere that would come later with the 13th Amendment in 1865, but it changed the course of history. It gave the Union a moral cause, inspired millions, and ensured that when victory finally came, America would emerge as a nation newly dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. When President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it did more than declare enslaved people in Confederate states free. It opened the doors of the Union Army to African Americans. For the first time, black men could officially enlist as soldiers and fight not only for the Union, but also for their own liberation. This was a turning point in the war. for it gave new strength to the Union and transformed the struggle into a true fight for freedom. At first, there was hesitation. Many white Northerners doubted whether African Americans could be good soldiers. Racism was deeply rooted, even in the Union. Some officers resisted the idea, and others thought black soldiers should only be used as laborers. But African Americans themselves knew the truth. This was their chance to prove their courage and claim their rightful place as free citizens. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African American men had served in the Union Army and Navy. They made up about 10% of the Union forces, a massive contribution. These men left behind families, farms, and jobs to join the fight, often facing greater risks than white soldiers. Yes. If captured by the Confederates, they could be enslaved again or even executed. Yet, despite these dangers, they marched forward with determination. One of the most famous African American units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a young white officer, the 54th became a symbol of black bravery and sacrifice. In July 1863, they led a daring assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The attack was fierce and bloody, with heavy losses, including Colonel Shaw himself. The courage of the 54th inspired the nation. Newspapers reported their heroism, and for many Americans, it shattered the myth that black soldiers lacked discipline or valor. African American soldiers often faced discrimination even within the Union Army. They were usually given lower pay than white soldiers, and were sometimes assigned to the hardest, most dangerous labor. At first, black soldiers earned only $10 a month compared to $13 for whites. But after protests and resistance, Congress finally granted them equal pay in 1864. Their persistence showed not only bravery on the battlefield, but also strength in demanding fairness. Beyond the Army, African Americans contributed in countless other ways. Many worked as laborers, cooks, nurses, and scouts. Women like Harriet Tubman served as spies and guides, leading Union raids and helping free hundreds of enslaved people. Their work behind the scenes was just as vital as the fighting on the front lines. The participation of African Americans in the Civil War also changed the meaning of freedom. When Union armies marched through the South, enslaved people often followed, seeking safety and joining the struggle. Each step they took toward the Union camp was a step toward liberation. For them, the war was not abstract, it was a personal fight for survival and dignity. Their service also reshaped the nation's future. By proving themselves as soldiers, African Americans showed they were not just passive victims of slavery, but active defenders of liberty. Their sacrifices strengthened the argument for full citizenship and civil rights after the war. Though the struggle for equality would continue for generations, their role in the Civil War laid the foundation for that fight. The story of African American soldiers is one of courage, sacrifice, and determination. They fought not only to save the Union, but to redefine it. Their bravery helped ensure that when victory came, it would not just be a victory for the North, it would be a victory for freedom itself. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had dragged on for more than 2 years. Both sides had suffered terrible losses, and neither seemed close to giving up. But that year brought two enormous battles, one in the east at Gettysburg and one in the west at Vicksburg, that changed the course of the entire war. Together, they became the turning point that began to tilt the balance in favor of the Union. Gettysburg, the high-water mark of the Confederacy in June 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched his second invasion of the North. He hoped to win a major victory on Union soil, forcing the North to lose heart and perhaps even pushing European countries like Britain or France to recognize the Confederacy. His army of about 75,000 men marched into Pennsylvania, full of confidence after earlier victories. The Union Army, under General George Meade, moved quickly to stop him. The two armies clashed at the small town of Gettysburg on July 1, 1863. For 3 days, the battle raged across hills, fields, and ridges. On the first day, Confederates pushed Union forces back. But by the second day, the Union held strong defensive positions on high ground, like Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top. The climax came on the third day with Pickett's charge. When 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched across open fields toward the Union Center, cannon fire and musket volleys tore through their ranks. Nearly half were killed, wounded, or captured. The charge failed, and Lee's army was forced to retreat back to Virginia. Gettysburg was a devastating blow for the South. Lee's dream of invading the North and forcing peace was shattered. More than 50,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in just 3 days, making it the bloodiest battle of the war. For the Union, Gettysburg became a symbol of hope and resilience. Vicksburg, the key to the Mississippi, while Gettysburg raged in the east. Another crucial battle was unfolding in the west. The city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, sat on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the river itself, a vital supply line for the Confederacy. General Ulysses S. Grant led the Union campaign to capture it. Grant surrounded the city in May 1863, cutting it off completely. For 6 long weeks, Union forces bombarded Vicksburg with artillery while starving the defenders inside. Food grew so scarce that civilians ate mules, rats, and even boiled shoe leather to survive. The suffering was immense, but the defenders refused to surrender until they could hold out no longer. On July 4, 1863, just 1 day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, the Confederate Army at Vicksburg finally surrendered. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. States like Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were cut off, making it far harder for the South to move supplies and men. The impact of Gettysburg and Vicksburg? The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked a huge turning point in the war. For the Confederacy, they were crushing defeats. Lee would never again launch a full-scale invasion of the North. The South's resources and morale began to weaken. For the Union, the victories brought renewed determination. Lincoln saw in Grant a general who could deliver results. And Grant's success in the West set him on the path to becoming overall commander of Union forces. Meanwhile, Lincoln prepared to give a speech at Gettysburg later that year, a speech that would remind Americans of the true purpose of the war: freedom and equality. Gettysburg and Vicksburg showed that the tide of war was changing. The Confederacy's high hopes began to sink, while the Union gained strength, strategy, and purpose. Though the war was far from over, the road to eventual Union victory was becoming clearer. In November 1863, just a few months after the bloody Battle of Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Pennsylvania to dedicate a new cemetery for the soldiers who had fallen there. Thousands of Union soldiers lay buried in those fields, and the ceremony was meant to honor their sacrifice. Many expected long speeches filled with political arguments and military praise. But what Lincoln gave instead was one of the shortest, yet most powerful speeches in American history: the Gettysburg Address. The main speaker that day was actually Edward Everett, a famous orator who spoke for nearly 2 hours. The crowd listened politely, but by the time Lincoln rose to speak, few expected much. His address lasted only about 2 minutes, containing fewer than 300 words. Yet in that brief time, Lincoln captured the very heart of the war and the meaning of America itself. Lincoln began by reminding the nation of its founding. For 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. With these words, he tied the Civil War directly to the American Revolution, reminding listeners that the nation had been born on the promise of liberty and equality. He then spoke about the sacrifice made at Gettysburg. He said the world would not long remember his words, but it could never forget what the soldiers had done there. Their bravery had given new meaning to the battlefield. The ground was hallowed not by speeches, but by the blood of those who fought and died for the cause of freedom. Finally, Lincoln looked to the future. He declared that the war was a test of whether any nation conceived in liberty could long survive. He urged Americans to commit themselves to ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In these words, Lincoln transformed the Civil War into more than just a fight to save the Union. It became a struggle for the survival of democracy itself. The Gettysburg Address was not just a tribute to fallen soldiers, it was a call to the living. Lincoln challenged the nation to finish the work they had begun, to make sure their sacrifice was not in vain. And to bring forth a new birth of freedom, he tied the war directly to the promise of equality, showing that slavery and democracy could not coexist. At the time, reactions to the speech were mixed. Some newspapers mocked its brevity or dismissed it as unimportant, but others recognized its greatness. Over time, the Gettysburg Address came to be seen as one of the most important speeches in American history. School children memorized it, leaders quoted it, and generations drew inspiration from its message. The power of Lincoln's words lay in their simplicity. In just a few sentences, he defined what America was and what it should strive to be. He reminded the nation that the Civil War was not just about territory, politics, or even victory. It was about preserving the very idea of freedom and equality for all people. Through the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln gave meaning to the suffering of war. He turned a battlefield of death into a symbol of hope, ensuring that the sacrifices made at Gettysburg would echo forever in the story of America. As the war stretched into its fourth year, the Union searched for ways to finally break the Confederacy's will to fight. One of the boldest and most controversial strategies came from Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. His campaign through Georgia, later known as Sherman's March to the Sea, became a symbol of total war destroying not only armies but also the very resources and spirit that kept the South going. In 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant, now commander of all Union armies, developed a plan to press the Confederacy from every side. While Grant himself pushed against Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, Sherman was ordered to move south from Tennessee into Georgia. His target was Atlanta, a major center for Confederate supplies, factories, and railroads. Sherman. This army of about 100,000 men began its campaign in May 1864. The march was not easy. Confederate forces fought fiercely, and the hot summer wore down the soldiers. But Sherman advanced steadily, using the Union's superior numbers and resources. By September, Atlanta fell into Union hands. The capture of the city sent shockwaves across the South and boosted Northern morale. In fact, Lincoln's re-election in 1864 was helped by this victory, as it convinced many voters that the war could indeed be won. But Sherman was not finished. After securing Atlanta, he launched his infamous March to the Sea in November 1864. With 60,000 men, he marched from Atlanta to Savannah, cutting a path through Georgia, nearly 300 miles long. His strategy was ruthless: destroy anything that might help the Confederate war effort. Railroads were torn up, factories burned, crops destroyed, and livestock taken. Towns and farms were left in ruins. Sherman believed this scorched earth tactic would crush the South's ability to resist and break the will of its people. For civilians, the march was terrifying. Families watched their homes go up in flames, their food taken, and their land ruined. Many Southerners hated Sherman, calling him a monster. Yet Sherman argued that his goal was not to kill civilians, but to end the war faster by making it impossible for the South to continue fighting. He later said, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." When Sherman reached Savannah in December 1864, he offered the city as a Christmas gift to President Lincoln. From there, his army turned north and continued its path of destruction through the Carolinas, further weakening the Confederacy. Sherman's march remains one of the most debated parts of the Civil War. To the South, it was remembered as an act of brutal devastation that scarred communities for generations. To the North, it was seen as a brilliant strategy that helped bring the war to a quicker end. What cannot be denied is its impact. Sherman's campaign shattered the South's infrastructure, crippled its economy, and drained its spirit. It showed that the Union was determined to do whatever it took to preserve the nation. For many, Sherman's march symbolized the harsh truth of total war, that victory sometimes required destroying not only armies, but the very foundations of a society built on slavery. By the time Sherman finished his march, the Confederacy was broken in both body and soul. The once proud South was left smoldering, and its dream of independence was slipping away. By 1864, the Union had found its strongest commander in Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike earlier generals who hesitated or retreated after setbacks, Grant was relentless. He believed the Union could only win by keeping constant pressure on the Confederacy. In Virginia, he faced Robert E. Lee, one of the greatest military minds of the South. Their clash would decide the future of the war. Grant took command of the Union Army in the East in the spring of 1864. His plan was straightforward but brutal. Attack Lee's army again and again, no matter the cost. Grant knew the Union had more men, more supplies, and more factories. If he could wear Lee down through continuous battles, the South would eventually collapse. It was a strategy of endurance, not just quick victories. The first great battle between Grant and Lee came in May 1864 in the dense forests of Virginia, known as the Wilderness. The fighting was chaotic. Trees caught fire, smoke filled the air, and men fought at close range in the tangled woods. Thousands were killed or wounded in just 2 days. But instead of retreating, as earlier Union generals had done, Grant marched forward. His message to Lincoln was clear. I propose to fight it out on this line. If it takes all summer. From there, the armies clashed again at Spotsylvania Courthouse and then at Cold Harbor. The battles were savage. At Cold Harbor, thousands of Union soldiers were cut down in minutes as they charged fortified Confederate positions. Soldiers pinned notes with their names on their coats, fearing their bodies would never be identified. Even Grant later admitted he regretted ordering that assault. Despite heavy Union losses, Grant refused to give up. He pressed Lee's army back toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, and then to the city of Petersburg, just south of it. Petersburg became the site of a long siege that lasted for nearly 9 months. Union troops dug trenches and launched repeated attacks, while Confederate soldiers, short on food and ammunition, desperately defended the city. Life in Petersburg was miserable. Soldiers on both sides endured hunger, mud, disease, and constant shelling. Civilians in Richmond and Petersburg also suffered terribly as supplies grew scarce. The South's ability to continue the war was stretched to the breaking point. Meanwhile, Sherman's march through the South was destroying Confederate morale and resources. The Confederacy was being squeezed from all directions. Lee's army, once strong and proud, was now starving and exhausted. Desertions increased as soldiers slipped away to help their struggling families back home. By early 1865, it was clear that the end was near. Grant's steady hammering and Lee's shrinking resources meant the Confederacy could not hold on much longer. The final battles in Virginia were not just fights over territory, they were a test of endurance. Between two determined generals and two nations locked in a deadly struggle, Grant's persistence showed the strength of the Union. Lee's defense showed the courage of the South. But history was moving toward a conclusion. The stage was set for the final act of the Civil War, the fall of Richmond and Lee's surrender at Appomattox. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate States were on the brink of collapse. General Robert E. Lee's army was starving, exhausted, and shrinking every day. Supplies were nearly gone, soldiers were deserting to return to their families, and morale was low. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant had surrounded them at Petersburg, holding the city in a long and brutal siege. After 9 months of struggle, the walls of the Confederacy were finally cracking. On April 2, 1865, Grant launched a massive assault on Petersburg. The Confederate lines, thin and weak, could not hold. Lee's army was forced to retreat. Without Petersburg, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, could no longer be defended. That same night, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and his government officials fled the city by train. The next morning, Union troops marched into Richmond. For many in the North, the fall of Richmond was a moment of triumph. Crowds cheered, flags waved, and newspapers declared that victory was near. But the scene inside the city was far from joyful. Fires raged as Confederate soldiers set warehouses and bridges ablaze to keep them from Union hands. Civilians fled in panic. Richmond, once the proud heart of the Confederacy, lay in ruins as Union soldiers raised their flag over the captured city. Yet the war was not over. Lee and his army were still on the move, trying to escape westward in hopes of joining other Confederate forces in North Carolina. Grant pursued them relentlessly. For days, the two armies marched and fought in small clashes across the Virginia countryside. But Lee's men had little food, little ammunition, and almost no hope. The chase could not last forever. Finally, on April 9, 1865, Lee realized the truth. His army could no longer fight. Surrounded at the small village of Appomattox Courthouse, he decided to surrender. That afternoon, Lee rode to a simple farmhouse owned by Wilmer McLean, where Grant awaited him. The meeting between the two generals became one of the most famous moments in American history. Lee arrived dressed in full uniform, his sword at his side, showing dignity even in defeat. Grant, in contrast, wore a plain and muddy uniform, reflecting his modest character. The two men spoke briefly before Grant wrote out the terms of surrender. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to go home, taking with them their horses and personal belongings. Officers could keep their sidearms. No one would be punished for treason. Grant even ordered Union soldiers not to cheer when the surrender was signed, saying the defeated Confederates were our countrymen again. Lee accepted the terms with quiet grace. When the meeting ended, he mounted his horse, Traveler, and rode back to his men. Many of his soldiers wept when they learned of the surrender, but Lee told them to go home and rebuild their lives in peace. The surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War, though some Confederate armies fought on for a few more weeks. The Confederacy as a nation was finished. After 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed, destruction, and sacrifice, the Union was preserved. The scene at Appomattox was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new chapter in American history. A nation once divided was whole again, but the wounds of slavery, destruction, and loss would take generations to heal. The Civil War had ended in April 1865. With the surrender at Appomattox, the United States began to breathe a sigh of relief. After 4 years of bloodshed, people were ready to heal and rebuild. No one carried the hopes of the nation more than President Abraham Lincoln. He had guided the Union through its darkest days, preserved the nation, and taken the first steps toward ending slavery forever. But tragically, Lincoln would not live to see the full rebirth of the country he fought so hard to save. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The play was a comedy called Our American Cousin, and Lincoln hoped for a brief moment of rest and joy. He was joined by his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and 2 guests. The theater was full of excitement, and people cheered when they saw the president enter his box. For many, Lincoln was already a hero, the man who had saved the Union. But in the crowd that night was a man filled with hate. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and passionate supporter of the Confederacy. Booth believed Lincoln was a tyrant who had destroyed the South. He dreamed that by killing Lincoln, he could avenge the Confederacy and inspire the South to rise again. For weeks he had plotted not just Lincoln's murder, but a wider plan to assassinate other government leaders, hoping to throw the Union into chaos. At around 10:15 p.m., as the audience laughed at a line in the play, Booth slipped into Lincoln's box. He carried a small pistol. Without warning, he fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward, mortally wounded. Mary screamed, and chaos erupted in the theater. Booth leapt from the box onto the stage, shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants." He broke his leg in the fall, but managed to escape through the back door, fleeing into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house where doctors worked desperately to save him. He quickly realized there was nothing they could do. Through the night, cabinet members, generals, and family gathered by his side. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton spoke the famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation was plunged into mourning. Bells tolled, flags flew at half-mast, and millions wept. People who had celebrated victory just days before now felt crushed by grief. Trains carried Lincoln's body on a long journey back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, where thousands lined the tracks to pay their respects. It was one of the greatest funerals the country had ever seen. Meanwhile, Booth's escape ended 12 days later. Union soldiers trapped him in a barn in Virginia. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire, and Booth was shot. His dream of reviving the Confederacy had died with him. Lincoln's assassination left deep scars. He had planned to lead the nation into a new era of healing and reconciliation, but instead his death left the future uncertain. The task of rebuilding would now fall to others, and without Lincoln's steady hand, the years ahead would be filled with struggle and conflict. Yet even in death, Lincoln's legacy endured. He became a symbol of freedom, unity, and sacrifice. His vision of a new birth of freedom, would inspire generations to come. The tragedy of his assassination reminded America that the fight for equality and justice was not yet finished. It was only beginning. With the Civil War ended and Abraham Lincoln gone, the United States entered a new and difficult chapter known as Reconstruction. The war had saved the Union and destroyed slavery, but it had also left the nation deeply wounded. Cities were burned, farms ruined, and families broken. Millions of people, both white and black, struggled to imagine what life after the war would look like. Reconstruction was supposed to heal the nation, but instead it brought bitter conflicts and difficult questions that tested America's strength once again. The first challenge was rebuilding the South itself. Much of the region lay in ruins. Railroads were twisted and destroyed, plantations abandoned, and homes reduced to ashes by years of fighting and Sherman's march. The Southern economy, once fueled by enslaved labor, collapsed. Without slavery, plantation owners lost their workforce, and formerly enslaved people, now free, searched for jobs and land. Hunger, poverty, and homelessness spread across the region. Another challenge was deciding how the former Confederate states would return to the Union. Should they be punished for rebellion or welcomed back quickly to promote healing? Lincoln had hoped for a gentle approach, offering amnesty to most Confederates if they swore loyalty. But after his death, harsher voices in Congress, known as the Radical Republicans, demanded strict conditions. They believed the South must be rebuilt on entirely new foundations, with equal rights guaranteed for freed African Americans. The fate of 4 million newly freed people was the greatest issue of all. Freedom was a cause for celebration, but freedom without support was difficult. Many freedmen had no land, no money, and no education. Families who had been torn apart by slavery searched desperately for lost children, parents, or spouses. The federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 to help, providing food, schools, and legal aid. The Bureau built thousands of schools, allowing African Americans to learn to read and write for the first time. Still, resources were limited, and the task was overwhelming. Politics made everything more complicated. President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Lincoln's assassination, favored a quick and lenient Reconstruction. He pardoned many ex-Confederates and allowed Southern states to pass laws known as Black Codes, which severely restricted the rights of freedmen. These laws tried to force African Americans back into a system of labor little better than slavery, denying them the right to vote, own land, or testify in court. This angered the Radical Republicans, who fought to protect the rights of freedmen. Over Johnson's vetoes, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States. Later, the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. For the first time, black men entered politics, winning seats in state legislatures and even in Congress. But progress met fierce resistance. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and terror to keep African Americans from exercising their rights. Night raids, lynchings, and intimidation spread fear across the South. Many freedmen risked their lives just to cast a ballot or attend school. Reconstruction was filled with hope and possibility, but also with betrayal and disappointment. For a brief time, America seemed ready to embrace equality and rebuild on the principles of liberty, yet racism, economic struggles, and political divisions slowed progress. By the 1870s, much of the North grew tired of the struggle, and federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction ended in 1877, leaving many promises unfulfilled. The challenges of Reconstruction remind us that winning a war is only the first step. Building peace, justice, and equality afterward is often harder. The Civil War ended slavery, but Reconstruction showed how difficult it was to create true freedom in a nation still divided by race, class, and history. The Civil War was fought not only on battlefields, but also in the hearts and minds of Americans. When the guns finally fell silent, the nation faced an even greater task: turning the promises of freedom into law. This effort was captured in 3 powerful amendments to the United States Constitution, the 13th, 14th Amendments, which together reshaped the very definition of liberty and citizenship. They became known as America's second founding, a new birth of freedom after years of division and slavery. The 13th Amendment, ending slavery forever. The first step was to make sure slavery could never return. The 13th Amendment passed by Congress in January 1865 and ratified later that year, declared neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. With these words, the institution that had haunted America for centuries was officially abolished. For millions of formerly enslaved people, the 13th Amendment was more than was a doorway into a new life. Families that had been torn apart could finally live without fear of being sold. Though freedom brought new challenges like poverty and discrimination, the legal end of slavery marked a victory generations had dreamed of. The 14th Amendment, citizenship and equality, freedom alone was not enough. Formerly enslaved people needed recognition as full members of society. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, guaranteed citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States, regardless of race. It also promised equal protection of the laws. This meant that every citizen, black or white, was entitled to the same rights under the Constitution. The 14th Amendment transformed America. Before, citizenship had been denied to enslaved people and even questioned for free African Americans. Now, anyone born on American soil was a citizen with rights the government had to respect. This amendment also gave Congress the power to enforce equality, planting the seeds for future civil rights battles more than a century later. The 15th Amendment, the right to vote, the final step in this trilogy of freedom, was political power. Without the right to vote, freedom could be easily taken away. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, declared that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For the first time, African American men could legally cast ballots, run for office, and take part in shaping the nation's future. During Reconstruction, thousands of black men voted, and many were elected to local and state offices. Some even served in Congress. This was a revolutionary change just a few years earlier. These same men had been enslaved. Now they were lawmakers, teachers, and leaders. It was proof that the struggle of the Civil War had not been in vain. The promise and the struggle together, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, created a new foundation for America. They declared that slavery was over, citizenship was universal, and political rights belonged to all. But the road ahead was not easy. Southern states resisted fiercely, using violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws to keep African Americans from enjoying these rights fully. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black voters, while poll taxes and literacy tests later weakened the power of the 15th Amendment. Still, these amendments stood as a permanent mark in the Constitution. They gave future generations the tools to fight for justice. From the civil rights movement of the 1960s to the ongoing struggles for equality today, the words of these amendments remain a shield of hope. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were more than legal changes. They were the moral victory of the Civil War. They showed that America could rise from division and create a nation truer to its founding ideals. Though the path forward was filled with obstacles, these amendments ensured that freedom, citizenship, and democracy would forever be at the heart of the United States. The American Civil War was not only the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, it was also one of the most heartbreaking. While battles, strategies, and political speeches fill the pages of history books, the true weight of the war was carried by the people who lived and died through it. Behind every statistic was a soldier, a mother, a child, or a community forever changed. Loss of life. Between 1861 and 1865, an estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers died, more than in all other American wars combined up to that point. Entire regiments were wiped out in a single day, as seen at Antietam, Gettysburg, or Chickamauga. Many families lost multiple sons or brothers, leaving parents and wives devastated. In some towns, nearly every household carried grief, and the sound of mourning became as common as church bells. But soldiers were not the only ones who suffered. Civilians, too, paid a terrible price. In the South, where most of the fighting took place, towns were destroyed, farms ruined, and thousands of men, women, and children were left homeless. Starvation spread as blockades cut off supplies, and diseases claimed countless lives. The war reached into every home, North and South alike, leaving no family untouched. The toll of disease, perhaps the most shocking truth, is that disease killed more soldiers than battle. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and crowded camps created breeding grounds for illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, fever, measles, and pneumonia. Medical knowledge was limited, and antibiotics did not exist. Amputations were often the only option for severe wounds, and without proper care, many men died from infection. Soldiers feared sickness almost as much as enemy bullets. Psychological scars of the Civil War also left invisible wounds. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress, but at the time people spoke of soldiers' heart or nervous disease. Men who had marched into battle full of pride often returned broken in spirit, haunted by what they had seen. Families struggled to understand the silence, anger, or sadness of returning veterans. The war did not end when the guns fell silent. For many, it lived on in their memories forever. Impact on families for women and children, the war's cost was measured in absence and hardship. Widows filled cities and towns, often left with little money or support. Orphans grew up without fathers, sometimes without mothers as well, if disease or hunger claimed them. Families who once dreamed of building prosperous farms or businesses instead faced the struggle of survival in a shattered nation. Enslaved families carried their own deep scars. Freedom brought joy, but it also revealed painful truths. Many families had been permanently torn apart by the slave trade. Mothers searched for children sold years earlier. Husbands sought wives and brothers sought brothers. For some, reunions were possible. For others, the war's cruelty had left wounds that could never fully heal. A nation in mourning. Cemeteries across the country became places of pilgrimage and sorrow. New burial grounds like Arlington National Cemetery were created to honor the fallen. Memorial services became part of American life. And Decoration Day, later known as Memorial Day, was established to remember those who had died. The Civil War's human cost went beyond numbers. It reshaped how Americans thought about sacrifice, freedom, and the price of conflict. The war proved that unity and liberty could demand unimaginable suffering. But it also showed the strength of a people who endured tragedy and still hoped for a better future. The human cost of the Civil War is a reminder that behind every cannon blast and musket volley were lives forever altered. It was a war fought not only on battlefields, but in homes, hospitals, and hearts. And its shadow of grief stretched across generations. The Civil War ended in 1865, but its impact did not fade when the guns went silent. Instead, the war left behind a legacy that shaped the future of the United States for generations. It was more than a conflict between North and South. It was a turning point in the nation's story, redefining freedom, government, and identity in ways still felt today, preserving the Union. The most immediate legacy was the preservation of the United States. Before the war, many wondered if a nation built on liberty and democracy could truly survive deep divisions. The victory of the Union proved that the United States would remain one nation, not a collection of separate states. The idea that states could break away whenever they disagreed was crushed. From then on, the Union was permanent. The end of slavery, the Civil War also destroyed the institution of slavery. Through the 13th Amendment, millions of African Americans were legally freed. Though freedom brought new struggles and challenges, it was a monumental shift in American history. The war turned the promise of the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal," into a reality, at least on paper. Expanding federal power, another legacy, was the strengthening of the federal government. Before the war, states often held more power than Washington. D.C., the Confederacy itself, had been built on the belief that states' rights were supreme. But after the Union victory, it was clear that the federal government held ultimate authority. This shift allowed future leaders to pass national laws on issues like civil rights, commerce, and education. Economic transformation, the war also reshaped the economy. In the North, industry boomed as factories produced weapons, uniforms, and railroads. After the war, this industrial power only grew, setting the stage for America's rise as a global economic leader. In the South, however, the economy was left shattered. Plantations were destroyed, enslaved labor was gone, and poverty spread. Recovery was slow, and the region remained economically behind the North for decades. Social and cultural impact. The legacy of the Civil War was also written in the hearts of its people. For African Americans, the war was the beginning of a long struggle for equality. Though the 14th and 15th Amendments promised citizenship and voting rights, discrimination and segregation would follow for many years. Still, the bravery of black soldiers and the promise of emancipation inspired future generations to continue the fight for civil rights. For white Americans, especially in the South, the war left deep scars. Many mourned their dead, clung to memories of the lost cause, and resisted change. The bitterness of defeat and the destruction of their society fueled resentment that lasted long after the war ended. National memory monuments, cemeteries, and stories of the Civil War became part of America's national memory. Soldiers, reunions, memorial days, and battlefield monuments kept the war alive in the minds of citizens. Literature and art reflected on the sacrifice, heroism, and tragedy. The Civil War became a defining event, much like the Revolution, shaping how Americans understood themselves. A nation redefined, perhaps the greatest legacy of the Civil War was the redefinition of America itself. It was no longer just a union of states loosely connected, it was a single nation, bound together by shared sacrifice. It was no longer a country where millions lived in chains. It was a place striving, however imperfectly, toward freedom and equality. The Civil War left the United States with wounds that took generations to heal, but it also gave the nation a new sense of purpose. It reminded Americans that liberty and democracy are fragile but worth defending at any cost. Its legacy continues to echo, reminding us that the fight for justice and unity is never truly finished. The American Civil War remains one of the most defining chapters in the nation's history. It was a war that tested the very soul of the United States. Whether a country built on liberty and democracy could survive division, slavery, and rebellion. The answer, won through blood and sacrifice, was yes. But the price was enormous. Between 1861 and 1865, the war claimed more than 600,000 lives, tore families apart, destroyed towns, and left scars that would last for generations. It was fought not only in fields and forests, but also in homes, hospitals, and hearts. Every soldier who marched, every family who mourned, every enslaved person who prayed for freedom carried a piece of this struggle. The war was not just a military conflict, it was a human tragedy and triumph combined. The Civil War preserved the Union, but it also transformed it. Before the war, America was a nation divided by slavery, unsure of its future. After the war, it emerged as a stronger, more unified country. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment, citizenship and equal protection were declared in the 14th, and voting rights promised in the 15th, though true equality would take far longer to achieve. The foundation was laid for a new vision of America. The legacy of leaders like Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Frederick Douglass, and countless unnamed soldiers continues to shape how we remember the war. Lincoln, taken too soon by assassination, became a martyr for unity and freedom. Grant's relentless determination proved the strength of perseverance. Douglas's voice reminded the nation that freedom without justice is incomplete. And the sacrifices of African American soldiers forever tied the Union cause to the fight for equality. Yet remembering the Civil War also means recognizing its unfinished work. Reconstruction brought progress, but also backlash. Racism, segregation, and inequality persisted long after the cannons went silent. Even today, debates over the meaning of the war, its causes, heroes, and symbols continue. History reminds us that healing takes time, and the promises of freedom must always be defended. The Civil War story is not just about the past, it is about the future. It teaches us the dangers of division, the cost of injustice, and the power of unity. It shows that democracy is fragile, but with courage, it can endure. The voices of the fallen still echo in the lessons we carry forward, that liberty is worth sacrifice, that equality is a struggle worth fighting for, and that a nation, once torn apart, can rise again. As we remember the Civil War, we honor not just the battles and leaders, but the ordinary people whose lives were forever changed. Their struggles and hopes remind us that history is alive in us today. The war may have ended more than 150 years ago, but its lessons remain timeless. Freedom, unity, justice are the pillars of Americand. They must never be forgotten.